They say the mountains remember. Long after the people have gone, long after the houses rot and the graves sink into the dirt, the mountains still whisper the names of those who tried to hide their sins. And if you listen closely, sometimes you can still hear them, voices tangled in the wind, calling out for redemption that never came. The story I'm about to tell you isn't one you'll find in any textbook. It isn't one the church ever dared to bless, or the county clerk ever wrote down in proper ink. This is a story the hills of Appalachia tried to swallow whole, but the earth doesn't forget. It never does. They called her Lila Mae. Some said she was the most beautiful girl to come out of Clay County, West Virginia, though beauty in those parts was less about symmetry and more about survival. She grew up in a one-room cabin, where the winters bit through the wood, and the only warmth came from bodies pressed too close together. She was quiet, delicate in a way that made men nervous and women suspicious. Her eyes held something older than her years, like she already knew the future wasn't hers to decide. When she was 16, her father took her to church one last time. The preacher spoke of purity, of Eve and the serpent, and when they left, her father told her she'd be married by summer. Lila didn't ask to whom, because in those hills, questions were dangerous. You learned early that silence was safer than truth. The man she married was old enough to be her grandfather. His name was Jeremiah Hale, a widower with land, cattle, and a reputation for keeping his bloodline pure. Folks in town whispered that the Hales didn't take wives from outside the ridge. They said it was to keep their legacy strong, but everyone knew what it really meant. The Hales belonged to themselves, and only themselves. Lila was 17 when she became Mrs. Hale. The wedding took place on a gray afternoon in a clearing behind the old mill. There was no preacher this time, no family but the groom's kin, a handful of pale, silent figures whose faces looked too similar to be strangers. They stood in a crooked circle as Jeremiah placed a brass ring on Lila's shaking hand. Somewhere behind her, a baby cried. She never did find out whose it was. The Hale home stood deep in the hollow, surrounded by mountains that blotted out the sun before evening. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and iron. Jeremiah's mother lived upstairs, confined to a bed no one ever changed. The walls were lined with portraits, faces that looked almost identical, eyes that followed you no matter where you stood. Lila would later learn that half of those people never made it past 30. It was on her second night there that Jeremiah told her about the promise. Every Hale bride, he said, was chosen to keep the blood unbroken. If she bore a daughter, that daughter would belong to the next generation of men in the line. It wasn't cruelty to him, it was duty, something sacred and ancient, older than law or God. He told her this as though explaining the weather, his rough hand resting on her stomach. Lila didn't speak. She just nodded. Because out there, disobedience was a kind of death. Years passed in a haze of seasons, winters that clawed through the walls, summers thick with rot. She gave birth 3 times. 2 stillborn. 1 survived. A boy. Jeremiah named him Isaac, after his father. And just like that, the promise was renewed. Isaac grew tall, quiet like his mother, sharp-eyed like his father. He spent most of his days hunting, or sitting by the river, throwing rocks and watching the ripples fade. But there was something strange between him and Lila, something the others noticed but never spoke of. She flinched when he touched her hand. He lingered too long in the doorway of her room. The old woman upstairs, Jeremiah's mother, muttered things no one wanted to hear. By the time Isaac turned 17, Jeremiah was half crippled from the mines. The land was failing, and the last of their livestock had died from disease. The family was unraveling. But one night, Jeremiah called Isaac into the parlor and spoke words his son would never forget. She was chosen, he said, his voice trembling with the weight of old tradition. And what was mine must pass to you. Lila didn't scream when she learned what that meant. She didn't run, didn't fight. She just stood by the window, watching the fog roll down the mountain. Somewhere in that silence, something inside her broke. When the spring came, Jeremiah's heart finally gave out. And on the night they buried him, shallow grave, no stone, Isaac came to her room. The rest, the county never wrote down. But when travelers passed through that hollow years later, they found the house empty. The portraits on the wall were torn down. And in the upstairs bedroom, they found a cradle, still rocking, though there was no wind. Some say the Hales died out that year. Others whisper they just moved deeper into the mountains, where the soil runs red and the rivers don't freeze. Every now and then, someone claims to have seen them, pale figures watching from the tree line, their eyes too close together, their voices soft and wrong. And when the fog settles thick over Clay County, the old-timers still lock their doors. Because they say the Hales are still looking for brides. The mountains remember. They always do. In the years that followed the vanishing of the Hale family, the hollow grew quiet, too quiet. The path to their homestead became overgrown, the well caved in, and the locals stopped speaking the name altogether. But silence in Appalachia is never the end of a story. It's only the start of a deeper burial. For decades, whispers crawled through Clay County like smoke. Hunters who strayed too far into the hills came back pale and trembling, muttering about strange lights flickering through the trees. Children dared each other to climb to the old Hale place, only to return with scratches down their arms and a smell on their clothes like rot and rain-soaked wood. No one dared go after dark. Then, in 1938, a government survey crew stumbled upon what was left of the Hale property. They were marking boundaries for a new logging road when they found the remains, a collapsed house, a scattered collection of personal effects, and a single iron cradle sunk halfway into the dirt. The report filed that year is brief. It mentions unusual skeletal findings and familial anomalies. Then it stops. The rest of the pages are missing. But one of the surveyors, a man named Peter Callow, kept a personal journal. In his notes, which were later found in an estate sale, he wrote about what they discovered inside that house. He described the bones, small, uneven, some with deformities too consistent to be coincidence. He described the crude carvings on the doorframes, the repeated initials, LH, scratched into the floorboards. And he described something that still haunts those who read it, a photograph, black and white, of a woman holding a child. The woman's face was half burned away, but the child's was clear, eyes too large, smile too knowing. On the back, a single word, mother. Peter left the region that same year. His notes end abruptly with a single line written in shaking script, it was the same face. The same as hers. The same as all of them. That photograph vanished from county records soon after. Some say it was destroyed. Others believe it was taken by a local historian named Mavis Trent, a woman who made it her life's work to collect the buried history of the Appalachian families that time tried to forget. In the 1950s, she began interviewing surviving locals who still remembered the Hales. What she found was worse than the rumors. They told her Lila May had once tried to flee. One stormy night, she packed what she could carry and ran down the mountain, barefoot and bleeding. She made it as far as the river before Isaac found her. Witnesses, if they can be called that, claimed he didn't drag her back right away. Instead, he stood there with her for hours, just watching the current. She told him something then, something no one could hear over the thunder. And when morning came, they were both gone. For years afterward, people saw fires burning on that hillside. Not the soft orange of a hearth, blue-white flames that burned too steady, too cold. Mavis believed they were digging up the graves, trying to purify the family bloodline. When she wrote her report in 1959, she ended it with a single, chilling thought: what if the Hales were not trying to hide their curse, but preserve it? Her manuscript was never published. 2 weeks after submitting it to the Clay County Historical Society, Mavis disappeared. Her car was found abandoned on the edge of the old logging road, her typewriter still inside, the final page half-typed. The last words on the page were, "She belonged to them both." It was around this time that the locals began speaking again, not openly, but in a kind of quiet confession that only comes after too many sleepless nights. They said that the bloodline had not died out. That a few of the Hale children, if you could call them children, had survived, taken in by distant relatives under false names. One became a preacher. Another ran a boarding house. And one, no one was sure. But they said if you looked closely enough, you could see it in their faces. The eyes. Too light, too wide. Always watching. By the 1970s, the Hale property was gone completely. The forest swallowed it whole. But sometimes, when the fog rolled down and the valley fell silent, travelers along Route 16 claimed they could see lanterns flickering deep in the trees. They said it looked like a wedding procession, figures dressed in white, moving single file through the dark, vanishing one by one into the mist. And those who dared to stop and listen swore they could hear singing. A woman's voice, low and trembling, carrying through the trees. The words too faint to make out, except for one. Promise. By then, the Hales had become a ghost story, told to keep children from wandering too far. But those who've lived long enough in those hills will tell you there's truth in every Appalachian legend. The soil keeps records. The roots don't lie. And every now and then, when someone digs a new foundation or clears a patch of earth for a home, something turns up, a bone, a charm, a fragment of something that was never meant to see daylight again. The state archives list dozens of unidentified remains found across Clay County between 1980 and 2004. Most of them were attributed to accidents or old unmarked cemeteries. But in at least 5 of those cases, the DNA showed something strange, a near-perfect genetic match across generations, as if the same blood had folded in on itself over and over. And still, the name Hale never appeared. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done, if this was your bloodline? Would you run? Or would you obey, like Lila did, when the mountains called you home? Because maybe the scariest part isn't that the Hales existed. It's that somewhere, they still might be why the time the 21st century crept into the valley, the Hale story had become a relic, something spoken of only by the old-timers with hands like roots and eyes dulled by too many winters. The young folks didn't believe anymore. They laughed when the elders warned them not to hike past the old river trail after dusk. They said the Hales were just another superstition, no different from banshees or haints. But the mountains never forget, and they do not forgive being laughed at. In 2011, a pair of amateur genealogists came to Clay County chasing a rumor. They were making a documentary about lost bloodlines of Appalachia. Their names were Martin and Claire Holt, a married couple from Ohio, both trained archivists with a fascination for genetic anomalies. They started with census records, tracing missing family branches that vanished between 1880 and 1920. That's when they found it, a handwritten entry for Jeremiah Hale, wife, and child, Clay County Hollow, 1911. There was no death date. No follow-up. Just a name that hung there, unfinished. Curiosity led them deeper. They combed through courthouse archives, church rosters, and burial logs, each time finding traces of the same family, misspelled, misplaced, deliberately altered. The Hales had rewritten themselves across generations. They'd taken new surnames, Hill, Hall, Hiles. The blood had never died. It had only hidden. When the Holts began their interviews, they noticed something strange. In every family they spoke to, there was always one person, a cousin, a distant uncle, who lived apart, away from town. Always near the tree line. Always with the same look in their eyes. Martin's field notes tell the story best. His last entries, recovered from his camera bag, describe their final trip into the hollow. November 17, 2011. Cold, wet, overcast. They'd been directed by an old woman at the general store, who told them she knew where the old blood still slept. She refused to say more, just whispered, "If you find them, don't stay for supper." They found the house near sunset, or what was left of it. Half buried, choked in ivy, the roof caved in long ago. But inside, it wasn't empty. There were signs of life. A candle burned low in a jar. Animal bones hung from string in the doorway. And carved into the hearthstone, that same single word that had haunted generations, promise. Claire wanted to leave. Martin insisted on one last photograph. He lifted his camera, focused on the wall, and froze. There were portraits there. Dozens of them, water-damaged but visible. And in every one, the same woman. Sometimes older, sometimes younger. Always with the same impossible eyes. The last photo on Martin's camera shows her too, standing behind Claire, her face just visible in the reflection of a broken mirror. The same eyes. The same faint smile. When the sheriff's department went looking 3 days later, they found the couple's car abandoned on the road. The trunk was open, the equipment missing. Only Martin's camera was found, half buried in mud near the riverbank. The footage ends abruptly, but there's sound. A woman's voice humming. And beneath it, another voice, a man's, whispering, she was promised. The investigation ended with no conclusions. Locals said it was the Hills taking back what was theirs. Others said it was just another pair of outsiders who underestimated the mountain. But there are those who claim the Holtz footage never made it to evidence. That it was taken, bought, buried, sealed away like everything else that bore the Hale name. And yet, every few years, someone digs it back up. A historian. A podcaster. A YouTube investigator. Always chasing the same thread, until they vanish into silence too. You can still find the descendants if you know where to look. The faces have thinned out, the names changed, but the blood hasn't gone cold. There's a family near Somersville, quiet folks who don't come to town much. Their children are pale, their speech old-fashioned. They keep to themselves. And once a year, on the anniversary of the first Hale wedding, they gather at night with lanterns. Neighbors say it looks like a funeral. But when the wind shifts, you can hear laughter. And a woman's voice, low and steady, singing an old hymn about obedience and blood. The song ends with the same refrain, over and over, what was his will be yours. What was yours was never yours at all. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe the bloodline really did fade, dissolving into the larger American story like smoke into fog. But the land remembers differently. People still find fragments, a child's shoe with initials carved inside, a locket with 2 faces identical and wrong, a ring engraved with the words, to my bride, to my son. Sometimes, hikers along the ridgeline still report hearing cries at night. Not screams, more like calling. One voice, then another, echoing the same word until it loses all meaning. Promise. 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 And if you ever wander that far, if you ever find yourself standing among the ruins of a forgotten home where the air feels too still, too heavy, you'll feel it. The presence of something ancient and cruel, stitched into the roots, waiting for its blood to come home. Because the truth buried in those hills is older than the Hales, older than Lila May, older than the church that tried to wash it clean. It's a truth about what happens when devotion turns to madness, and love turns to ownership. When a man believes his name is worth more than the life of the woman beside him. The Hale family wasn't the first to make that promise. And they won't be the last. Somewhere out there, a bride still waits. Her name might not be Lila. The mountains might not be the same. But her story always ends the same way, with a ring, a vow, and a silence so deep it feels like the earth itself is listening. And if you ever hear that silence, if the wind dies just long enough for you to catch the faintest hum of a woman's song, don't look for her. Don't follow the voice. Because the mountains remember. And they're still keeping count.